All right, we're doing our best to keep to time. Now we're going to turn to our third panel of the day. We're going to shift our focus to the health of our democracy here at home. On January 6th, 2023, a bipartisan group of American defense and intelligence leaders and former elected officials spanning 5 presidential administrations participated in an unscripted role-play exercise. The exercise is the subject of a documentary film, War Game, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and explores the very real threat of domestic extremism and hyperpolarization. We are thrilled to have with us today 5 of the participants in that exercise. They will talk to us about that experience and the lessons they draw from it as we approach another American election, the verdict of which has enormous stakes. Please welcome them to the stage, including our moderator, Janessa Goldbeck, a 2009 Truman political partner.
That was fun. Props to the graphics team. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. My name's Janessa Goldbeck. I was a political partner selected in 2009, have served many roles at Truman since, co-founded the San Diego chapter with Kristen Cavanaugh and Sean Van Diver a few years back, and served as a member director on Truman's board also a couple of years ago. So I've had many different Truman iterations, but it's a real thrill to be with you here today at this amazing space. We're here today to talk about the film War Game and the project that came together to create this film. My organization, Vet Voice Foundation, is a 501c3 nonprofit, represents about 1.5 million vets and military families across the country, and our mission is to lift up their voices in our democracy, whether that's through running for office or advocating for policy reform or change at the local all the way up to the federal level. And one of the things that we have been increasingly concerned about over the last several years is the rise of domestic extremism, both in society writ large, but in particular within the veteran and military community. And so we know that there are many groups and many amazing, smart folks who are thinking about threats to democracy here at home, but we saw a gap in what we believed was really folks who had the ability to look into the military community and had the credibility to sort of peel it apart. We've seen in Congress a real lack of bipartisan cohesion on the even existence of the threat. And so as veterans ourselves, I served in the Marine Corps for 7 years, we wanted to bring some light to this issue. So on January 6, 2023, we convened 35 senior members of former government officials, elected leaders, and very high-ranking folks in the national security space to come together and examine this issue set, to participate in a 6-hour unscripted role play, all of which was the subject of a documentary film. So we're going to show you a couple clips today, but before we do, I just want to introduce everyone on stage. Senator Doug Jones from Alabama, Governor Steve Bullock from Montana, and Chris Jones, fellow Marine and from all over the place, but most recently Ukraine. General Linda Singh was going to be here today. We were both in New York last night for a screening of the film, and her Acela train got canceled, so she's very sorry she's not here today, but wishes she was here with us. So with that, let's go ahead and roll clip 1, and then we'll get into the discussion. All of us are here today because we are increasingly concerned by the rise of domestic extremism and radicalization in this country. specifically within the active duty military forces. I don't need to tell you that the alarms are flashing red. Most of you have at one point sworn under oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Today, we'll examine a frightening scenario. What happens when those in uniform break that oath?
I think what brought us all together is a need to be better prepared. And the exercise is Introduction to Coup Prevention 101.
I'm a retired lieutenant general. I spent 37 years in the Army. I'm pretty adamantly nonpartisan. In fact, that was one of my conditions for participation, that it was not a partisan exercise, because this should not be about politics. This is about security.
So my first question is for you, Governor Bullock. You played the President of the United States in the exercise. Could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to participate and what you see are the stakes?
Yeah, in some respects, I probably participated because everyone else said no, because how otherwise would I have, Governor of Montana. But two things, one of which, when I was approached, the caliber of the people that had agreed to be part of it, right? When you have, this was noted, 5 different administrations, half Democrats, half Republicans, and really, really impressive people. And second of which is that, look, every time I ran for office, I'd say this is the most important election in our lifetime. And maybe I did that to try to raise money. But this is the most important election in our lifetime. And the notion that there are certain norms that we should all be able to expect. And the notion that those norms no longer matter as they did. And the notion and the idea of doing this wasn't about a movie, it was about what can we learn to make sure that we as a country are better prepared, not just for the day, but also what we can do after that day. Meaning that at some point, like I was really hoping by this point, our nation would be healed and on some better direction. We're not. I thought it was important enough to do this exercise because we all still, in government, outside of government, have a lot to learn, not only about what's happening in the military, but what's happening in this deeply divided nation.
Senator, before you served in the United States Senate, you were an attorney general, and in this game, you played the Attorney General of the United States. Could you talk a little bit about some of the legal questions that were brought up throughout the course of the gameplay and some of the things you're thinking about now, especially in the new era we're in since yesterday's verdict?
Sure. Let me, before I get to some of that, let me set the stage, because I assume everybody's not seen this movie. Well, we were in a room, probably about 3 times this big, maybe just 2 times. And in one corner, you had the Department of Defense, and another the Department of Justice, and another Department of Homeland Security. Then you had the White House. And in the middle was the Situation Room. And we had different players in each of those corners. And then the Situation Room were the players that you would expect in the Situation Room here. And it truly was unscripted. We were given a fact scenario in which Steve had won a narrow election, re-election, but yet his opponent was not conceding, was going rogue, and there was a group of individuals in a camp outside in Northern Virginia who were gathering to storm the Capitol. And that's basically all we knew until that day when they started storming the Capitol. And we got thrown a lot of curves, because you had Chris, you had a couple of other folks. Bill Kristol was involved. You had the bad guys in another room that were also unscripted, saying, okay, this is what we need to do now. So what you see when you see this movie is truly an unscripted thing, and what Steve said about being able to react and all was absolutely correct. And in playing the Attorney General and having the role of the Attorney General, I think was a little bit unique, because we were concerned not just with what was going on that day, but there's a whole separate thing that really is not making it to the movie because it's not what it was about. But we also had to determine from a legal standpoint, how do we begin a criminal investigation? What do we need to be doing to help stem the tide of what we see going on at the Capitol and in states around the country, but also what do we do, how do we get things moving to investigate and potentially bring charges for those that are committing crimes. The biggest legal issue that I think was the theme that ran throughout the entire day was about the Insurrection Act. What happens and whether or not we wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act. Now, ultimately, spoiler alert, he did not. And I think it was absolutely the right call. But that was the biggest issue that I think that we had to deal with. And I think, and Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all the participants in that exercise saw that as a last resort. Absolutely saw that as a last resort. But we were seriously considering it, and it was being discussed, and we came close a couple of times. What I worry about going forward is that there will be an administration that sees that as the first thing that they do. That they will use the military, they will call out the military against citizens of the United States, regardless of what's going on. And I think that's a real danger. And from a legal standpoint, I don't think the Insurrection Act is perfect, by the way. I think it needs a little tweaking. I think there needs to be some looking. But it's really going to depend on who's going to make that call. I'm glad we had Steve as president that day, because you had a thoughtful person, and that's what you're going to need if things happen again. And I do worry about things happening again, especially after yesterday.
That's a great segue for clip number 2.
Mr. President, you'll want to see this from your special advisor. MacDill Air Force Base appears to have been taken over by insurgents. Active duty soldiers across the country are leaving their posts or being removed from duty, including 12 special operations forces based at MacDill Air Force Base, who have declared the base to be sovereign land, no longer subject to the jurisdiction of this illegal government. Further reports indicate that at many of these bases, there are corresponding accounts of ammunition, explosives, and other weapons missing from armories. Lastly, several disloyal forces have been caught trying to steal weapons and become trapped inside the armory, creating complicated standoffs between loyal forces and entrapped disloyal ones.
You have 12 special ops.
Yeah, it says
East
that.
MacDill, you reading this?
Yeah.
So remember that Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. There are times when you start throwing the bullshit flag, and you start fiddling around with niceties, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Mr. President, we're picking up intercepted chatter among military that they're taking what happened at MacDill and now they're trying to spread that to other bases.
How many soldiers are at MacDill?
12 that have gone rogue is what I understood.
Not that many. These are 12, gung-ho killers out there who decided to take it in their own hands.
So
you got two 4-star generals down there.
The concern we're getting is the chatter that this may spread, and y'all need to be aware of that, I think.
So, Chris, you were one of the leaders of our red cell in wargaming terminology. These are folks who are trying to...
Wasn't political terminology at all,
Yeah.
folks, okay? Let's just make that clear.
That's right. Those classic wargaming terminology outside of our political colors. But your job was to disrupt the blue cell and to try to force them to overreact, overcommit. Could you talk a little bit about how you envisioned your role and what your perspective was as a player on the red cell?
Yeah, so I, as you mentioned, we were there very much to, for 2 years prior to that, I've been working with another Truman member, Chris Goldsmith, leading research for his organization, Task Force Butler. We'd been staring at this, the real world version of what we were simulating for 2 years, and really, trying to make sure we had the most accurate, maybe not the most convenient, but the most accurate picture of what the threat landscape looked like. And one of the best days at work was when Chris said, okay, take everything we know actually exists there. Now you get to put together, an actual game plan, and then we're going to simulate it. So, you mentioned the Insurrection Act, which is something you would hope is a last case resort. From the red cell perspective, that was the first thing we wanted the government to reach to, because it didn't really matter what the specific ideology is. You can slice and dice the domestic extremism, domestic terror landscape a million ways. The unifying factor is being anti-government because of, we are a democracy that protects people that if you're a white supremacist, you don't want to protect. The Insurrection Act and the government being willing to shoot Americans is exactly what I need to enact all of my goals, right? I want to replace the government, and a government that shoots its citizens is one that is probably going to get replaced soon by something else. So for us, it was really take things that we know exist. We were coming into the pre-simulation briefings with like, look, here's a 3D printed mortar system, right? Here's 3D printed rocket launchers. We're bringing these in not because it's a doomsday thing that will be really hard to counter. It's because there's people in Kentucky who make these right now in their backyard for fun. We were bringing things like, as you saw in the clip, you don't need 500 soldiers, from a brigade going rogue. You need 5 to 6 special operations command soldiers, being willing to do something like that where, again, we want to generate as much noise and cause the government to overreact. And that playbook is very much taken straight out of, domestic terror, domestic extremist organizations that exist and operate right now.
Could you talk a little bit about the group that you created and how that came to be?
This is the brainchild of Chris Goldsmith. It was called the Knights of Columbus. And it was really an amalgamation of a few different, brands of domestic terror groups. It very much
Order of Columbus.
Order of Columbus.
Right.
What did I call it?
Knights of Columbus is
no, that's real. There's a lot of B-roll that got cut because I kept calling it Knights of Columbus, and Chris was like, "That's."
I want to get in trouble with the Knights.
Yeah. So sorry to any Knights of Columbus in the room. You are not domestic terrorists. We are. Order of Columbus. The snapshot of it, is basically a Christian nationalist far-right group. We were using churches and the legal structures of churches for tax-exempt status in order to basically fund and operate a militia. We were building, notionally we weren't really doing it, but having training ranges disguised as churches, which allowed us to mobilize hundreds of armed actors within 50 miles of Washington, D.C. without any real legal obligation to disclose it. We were very much drawing from both the illegitimate person who was claiming to have won an election that he had lost, but also having a figurehead that was largely based off of former General Michael Flynn, right, who was kind of more of an ideological, borderline spiritual figurehead, because one of the things we found at Task Force Butler and working in this space is how powerful the veteran brand and identity is for far-right groups, not just because we know how to shoot things and blow things up, more so because we are such a legitimizing factor to so many, really whatever policy or political issue you have. If you can get a veteran out front, especially one that has a proven record and a perceived sense of legitimacy, that's a really, really big combat multiplier, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, the Order of Columbus was really drawn from the organizations and groups that actually exist and operate right now, and really tried to color within the lines of, this can/will exist, and not getting too fanciful with it.
Well, let's go ahead and roll clip 3.
Been released on social media by the heads of the so-called Order of Columbus, the extremist group which has long challenged the legitimacy of the US government. Retired Army Lieutenant General Roger Sims, who the order refers to as the Patriarch, is claiming to have evidence of a stolen election, and the group is backing those members of the military who have appeared to have gone rogue. Now, this video was released just a short time ago. We're going to play it for you. A word of warning, some of what you'll hear is disturbing.
We have undertaken an extensive investigation of the 2024 election.
And it is Hotham who is attempting a coup to consolidate his illegitimate power and eliminate our God-given freedoms.
So the red cell is motivated not just by a failed candidate who's trying to steal the presidency, but also by a religious figure, someone with military experience who comes with a lot of credibility, like former General Michael Flynn, a convicted felon who spent his career fighting against insurgencies It is not unrealistic that figures like him could play roles in an attack.
Those of you who are feeling weak tonight, those of you that don't have the moral fiber in your body, get some tonight, because tomorrow we the people are going to be here, and we want you to know that we will not stand for a lie. We will not stand for a lie.
A figure like that can be used to help recruit Americans into a belief system that justifies violence against other Americans to achieve political goals, which is the definition of terrorism.
Governor Bullock, could you talk a little bit about the prevalence? I mean, I think we hear about domestic extremists. We know veterans were overrepresented in the January 6th population of folks who stormed the Capitol. But how have you seen this in leadership?
Yeah, and look, right, veterans are 6% of our population. About 20% of the people that were convicted after January 6th were veterans. One of the things, ultimately, hopefully, the takeaway from a movie like this isn't to hurt the veteran brand. I mean, in Montana, 1 out of every 10 Montanans served our country. And we need to be making sure that we're providing the support not just while they're in the military, but afterwards. But directly to your question, 15 years ago, I was Attorney General. I was dealing with the Oath Keepers trying to recruit my state police. 30 years ago, there was the Freemen in eastern Montana, which thought that the highest level of government was a county sheriff, and they would put liens on everyone. 30 years ago was Ruby Ridge. 30 years ago was Waco. Like, this has been part of our country. This isn't something new. Like, Donald Trump didn't cause this, right? It's been there all along, or at least clearly for the last few decades. And the vigilance and the necessity, when Stuart Rhodes, the head of the Oath Keepers, literally said what we hoped on January 6th, to Chris's point, was that the Insurrection Act would be invoked. Like, this has been a long-term play, and it's part of what we are as a country right now. And it's also something that we have to be very, very vigilant about to try to ensure that this doesn't end up, by Chris's experience, it doesn't take half the veterans, it doesn't take half of military base, it takes elevating enough that will further radicalize others.
Janessa, can I follow up? Because Steve mentioned something about his state police. There was another aspect of this, too, that just didn't involve veterans, and that's the infiltration of local law enforcement. Because part of what you saw in this movie is that there were also insurrections taking place at state capitals. And there is a real concern in this country today, and it has also gone on, that the far-right radicals, whether you can talk about it religious or racial, that local law enforcement has a problem. That is one of the reasons that you have seen over the last few years, particularly since George Floyd's death, a serious effort to try to figure out from a local standpoint, because that's sometimes where the rubber meets the road. And I can tell you, those that don't know my history, was actually not an attorney general. I was the U.S. attorney in Birmingham, Alabama, that under the Clinton administration, and we prosecuted the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed 4 little girls. And I can never forget talking to my local DA. And when they had moved the office at one point, they found an old photograph of a Klan rally in Birmingham in like 1960, 61. And the wind was blowing. And there were like 3 of the Klan robes that were blowing up, and you could see Birmingham police uniforms underneath. That is still going on. That is still happening, and it is something that I think has to be dealt with, specifically if we're going to see things popping up in various states, at not just the U.S. Capitol, but at the Capitol of whether it's Georgia or Arizona or other swing states where people are trying to get electors elected that did not get the popular vote.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. And I apologize for getting your attorney.
That's okay. I love getting elevated. It's
You know, I think one of the things we really wanted to break open over the course of this exercise was examining what are norms and what are laws, and where there is room for norms to be ignored or broken. One of the things that we saw repeatedly throughout the exercise was the prevalence of dis and misinformation. The zone was flooded by red cell of photos, images, news stories that were hard to verify or had caught fire on our internal social network before the government had a chance to respond. Chris, you're also a journalist. Could you talk, have you been a journalist in the past? Could you talk a little bit about the role of the media and also current threats to the media that may exist, and the role of disinformation in general?
Yeah, so you know, as you were saying, one of our biggest kind of things that we were doing day of was not so much even the on-the-ground, you know, attacks. There was actually a relatively small number of, you know, notional people who were doing violence around the country. But the bigger output really was our ability to fire hose as much noise as possible to make it harder for that situation room to get signal, right, and understand what that ground truth is. You know, myself and the other members of the Red Cell, what we were doing wasn't sophisticated. There was no AI, nothing was pre-planned. I was going on YouTube, ripping off audio from one video from something else, slapping something, you know, totally made up on it, and it looked like a CNN story, right? This is not like a very sophisticated digital actor in terms of who's churning this stuff out. And that threat, you know, that ability to generate noise, that ability to get between good faith actors and American citizens around elections obviously has increased. You know, the use of AI means a lot more people are going to be able to generate a lot more sophisticated stuff. We don't necessarily see it being used by the far right yet, but we certainly see it, you know, attempts to deploy it from foreign actors who use the far right as a lever that they can pull in this country with pretty low input. And, you know, I think speaking to how threats have shifted specifically around the press, you know, the single greatest early warning system that the United States possesses when it comes to domestic extremism is local journalism, period, bar none, right? You can pay a lot of really important think tanks a lot of money for a report. I can tell you from experience, they were reading a bunch of local journalism, aggregating it, and telling you something that somebody making $12,000 a year in a rural town knows instinctively because they live it every day. And the reason those local journalists are really good at what they do is because the people they're predominantly interacting with are the primary targets of far-right domestic terror violence. And, you know, a lot of things has changed. One thing that hasn't is the fact that the primary targets for violence, you know, political violence, domestic terrorism in this country, it's the LGBTQ community, it's Black and brown Americans, and it's religious minorities, specifically Muslims. That has not changed. Local press meets with those people because they keep track of these organizations and what they're doing and not doing as a matter of survival. Local journalists have the trust with those relationships to responsibly convey that to a broader public. Local journalism is also dying. That's not an understatement. The ability for our country to have very accurate, localized understandings of the localized manifestations of this issue is diminishing. You know, I think if there is any one kind of trite takeaway I always say is like, look, if you think defending America against domestic extremism, you know, starts at the outskirts of DC or New York City or LA, you are not going to see the next January 6th coming. I covered domestic extremism in West Virginia for 2 years prior to January 6th. I knew January 6th was going to be what it was in October because I was watching people put together bus manifests and try and ship hundreds of people down there. And I was then seeing those people at the gun range deciding which guns they were going to bring. Nobody really was interested in hearing from me until January 7th. The threat is going to be different. It's not going to look like January 6th, but really empowering the civil society actors, specifically local press, to be able to, you know, give everyone in this room, the people that we want to address, the information that they need. That is a vital aspect that I think is not being supported in a meaningful way.
Janessa, could I just add, at times I feel like a interpreter You know, I'm coming from a foreign place. It's called Montana. Like, you all wouldn't understand that. Truly, 6 out of 8 of our major communities, the largest 8 communities, 6 out of 8 no longer have a daily printed newspaper. And that's not unique to Montana. If you look at half the television stations are owned by Sinclair. That is happening all across our country in ex-urban areas.
Thank you. I think we have one more clip.
Be a defining moment of your presidency.
It is. But here's what's missing in this. We have to understand why they want to give command and control to the president. The Insurrection Act is a trap.
We need to have a further conversation.
It's a defining moment in their governorship.
We have what? Mr. President, your audience is the American public, and they want to know that Congress is coming back to certify. So we do have to come to agreement here, because time is moving on. You have to decide which way you're going to want to move.
Mr. President, 10 minutes remaining.
The president is sweaty. He's going to have to make a decision.
Mr. President, are you invoking the Insurrection Act or federalizing National Guard? Neither has happened yet. I'm not asking you, I'm asking the President. Are you doing either?
Mr. President?
Mr. President.
Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President,
Mr. President.
Put your fucking cards on the table.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Just a little bit of pressure there, Steve.
Yeah. What could go wrong?
I do, before we turn it over to Q&A, I do want to get a little bit more into the Insurrection Act, federalizing the Guard, in particular because in the Project 2025 report that was put out by the Heritage Foundation, one of the first things that they instructed or have said that they would like Trump to do, should he be reelected, is to use the National Guard to conduct mass deportations and a host of other things. And I want to get a little bit more into the authorities that exist and what that means, and if there are things that we can be doing now to shore up our understanding of what those authorities are.
With me?
To either of
yeah,
them, sure.
Easy question. Thanks for telling us about that one, Janessa. and look, there are, so I also, during my 8 years as governor, for 6 of the 8, served on the Council of Governors. Council of Governors, they take 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and as commanders-in-chief of our National Guard, then we're the ones that interact with all of you in Washington, D.C. Last administration, there was an attempt, not necessarily from, and I'm not going to ascribe this to the president, to actually change it so that troops could come in under the Insurrection Act without the governor even making that request. So this is significant. Like anything that would dilute in the system of federalism where all of a sudden either the DOD could nationalize or the president could nationalize my or our state's Guard soldiers and turn them against citizens or have regular Army. You know, this goes back to posse comitatus. Like the authorities in some respects, I mean, I think one of the advantages for me in this system was as a governor, I knew that if I needed I've sent soldiers and airmen down to California to fight fires. I did that through mutual aid, governor to governor. But if what Project 2025 ultimately did is change that. So you're using the individuals. I mean, I'll never forget, first year I was in office, I had 750 Montana soldiers overseas in Kuwait and Afghanistan. People I went to high school with. They were there over a year. I went and visited them. Like, these people commit to our country. They should never be put in a position, certainly, where they're being used as political pawns.
And Janessa, Congress could act. Congress can tighten up They could get those definitions and they could tighten up when they could do some things. The problem that you got now is that, can y'all tell me the last time Congress acted? It won't happen. It won't happen. Not as with Congress the way they're, and the rules in the Senate and everything else. It's just not going to happen. But they could do that. And that's going to leave this to the judgment of the people sitting in the Situation Room and ultimately the president. And by the way, the one thing about what you saw in the movie I think was a little bit disservice to Steve. It almost made it appear that he deliberated for 5.5 of the 6 hours that we were doing. It really was not. This was a 6-hour deliberation of everybody and it went through. But I do think that ultimately this is going to come down to who is sitting in that Situation Room and who is sitting behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. And they're going to either do it or they're not going to do it. And I worry that they're going to do it and then say, okay, challenge me. Somebody stop me. And that's going to, it will fall to the military. It may fall to the commander of the National Guard in a particular state or the governor. And then you've got the whole system. How is somebody going to, how you think you're going to feel if you go into court and the President of the United States has for 3-4 years said, this is a rigged judicial system. We can't have confidence in our court systems. It's a bigger problem than I think folks think about, that fully understand. They haven't gotten into the nuances. But at the end of the day, all of this, I think everything we did ended up coming down to the integrity and the belief in our Constitution and in this country on how you proceed. And that's what we've got to be fearful of, and that's what we've got to protect come the next few years.
Yeah, I'd only add one more thing, thinking back to your question too, is that, like, I remember when I was in office, I was asked to send some of my National Guard to the border by the president. I said no. If Doug Ducey, who was the governor of Arizona, had called me and said, Bullock, can you spare some soldiers to provide us assistance on the border, I probably would have said yes. In both of those instances, I mean, what protected and what made my decision-making is expectation that certain norms are going to be understood and respected and followed. Like, the norms, if they're alive, are still there to protect us, but when we lose those norms, as the senator who was my attorney general said, talk about this 250-year experiment called representative democracy. So much of it is based on actually adhering to some base norms. And when we lose those, when a quarter of Americans, according to polling in March, said that the FBI was behind January 6th, when you have 170 election deniers in Congress from 36 states, or 26 election deniers at the state level in 19 states, those norms that we rely on are being so desperately challenged and tested right now, if not eviscerated.
Well, on that cheery note, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have a question, please feel free to line up behind the mics. And I'll start over here with you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Catherine Pratt, DEF CON 2018. So I know you mentioned didn't use AI, but right now in the real world, foreign actors are stoking a lot of right-wing activities, encouraging alt-right fervor by using AI and misinformation and disinformation. What can Truman members do to maybe counter this narrative, raise awareness of it as we lead up to the next election? Because there is a lot of this going on in the world right now. Thank you.
Chris, you want to?
Yeah, if you can make a publicly available resource that I can plug any piece of political information in and it'll tell me if it's AI or not, like the kind of things that we know companies like Microsoft have, that'd be sick. If you could give it to local journalists first, that'd be sicker. No, I think one, you know, when it comes to AI, right, the underlying thing that AI just enables the volume to increase. It's not actually changing the core thing that's being deployed, which is relying on your emotional, real and perceived grievances to make you not believe the truth or to put, you know, an alternative worldview in front of you. Trying to go after AI or counter AI specifically is, I mean, good luck playing whack-a-mole with the scope of AI is insane, right? I do think that the solve there is by going after that root cause, and part of it is by, you know, not to beat the dying horse of local journalism, but similar civic institutions, right? It's a lot of the people who are susceptible to this stuff don't have another source of information that they genuinely trust because it's accessible to them. I think the thing you can do is give people an alternative, something that's based in the experience and place where they live and are experiencing things that make them look for these kind of conspiratorial worldviews. Give them an alternative that they can trust and is going to respond to their needs. I don't know if there's a tech solve to AI, but disinformation comes down to our communities.
Well, one of the things that I think we were at a disadvantage of in doing this exercise is that Chris and all those guys in the red team were utilizing social media like crazy. We did not have a social media presence that we could use to respond to get the word out. And I would encourage all folks to assist in trying to get information out there when you see something, when you know something, and encourage the administration to do the same. There will be a reluctance in this administration to do anything that appears to be political and critical. I think they got to throw caution to the wind on that, because I think the misinformation that we are seeing already, that is only going to get exacerbated with AI, should be challenged at every turn, not just by the public, but by government officials in the know.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mari Manoogian. I previously was a Michigan state representative. I was in the Capitol on April 30th when we saw the dress rehearsal for January 6th. And I actually get choked up thinking about it. But my question is, how can we get people, I guess, with a level of authority in our state capitals to take this threat really seriously? I'm very concerned it's going to happen to my friends and I again. I know a lot of us have frequently seen mental health professionals because of what we've all been through. And I think part of what has been so disheartening and hard to work through with regard to all of that is just the fact that people didn't take it seriously, and that there were, in fact, people who were in charge of our Capitol building at the time who allowed that threat to come into the building and even encouraged it. And just seeing with the simulation and sort of seeing the reaction, particularly from folks on the right, to the conviction of the former president yesterday, I'm incredibly concerned about what that's going to look like in the future, and would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Mari, I want to say thank you for your service to our country, and I'm sorry for what you had to endure. If you could raise your hand if you're working on the issue of potential violence in states following the election, I think that would be, is there anyone in this room who's working on that issue? Okay, so I would love to circle up after if that's something you're working on and want to talk more about. At Voice Foundation, we're working with a number of partners in the space to do a series of smaller scale off-the-record exercises later this year with the Adjutant General, so state National Guard commanders, attorneys general, and staff from governor's offices, so that they actually have an opportunity to think through some of the threats that they may be facing following the election and heading into January, but also in some cases to meet each other. I mean, I think I can let Steve speak to this. It's different in every state, but oftentimes the offices of the National Guard are not necessarily super tied in with some of the key staff in leadership and and decision making, and we really want to make sure that people have each other's cell phone numbers before there's a crisis, that they've had the chance to think through hard things together before something happens, that they need to respond in concert and with trust. And we're also going to be involving local journalists in those exercises. To Chris's point, local journalism is the front line of how these things take shape, and so we think it's really important to involve those folks. So if you're interested in learning more, happy to talk more about that after, and please come find me if you're working on these issues. Next question.
Hi, everyone. Matt Pilak, been in the Army and the National Guard for the last 28 years, which seems like an eternity. But I think this is mainly directed towards the governor. How do we prevent the continued politicization of National Guard troops or the deployments of National Guard troops? Like, how do we create a higher bar for those deployments? It's been happening from Republican governors, Democratic governors, as long as I've been in. And I don't think that folks appreciate that it can radicalize National Guard soldiers by going on these missions that they shouldn't be on. It's a recruitment or a retention deterrent. We've got folks getting out because they don't want to sit in a parking garage in the Capitol post-January 6th. They don't want to work in the New York City subways. New York State has been very guilty of this over the last 25 years. We still have soldiers in Penn Station, right? It's now a jobs program for the governor more so than it is anything else. And so it just becomes a situation where troops are getting out of the Army because they don't want to go on these missions anymore. And then some folks that are more susceptible to radicalization are becoming radicalized because they see the political use of soldiers. And so there's got to be a way to create a higher bar for that. Thank you.
Jessa, not to interrupt you, Mr. Governor, but an anecdotal example, because I don't need to go after you. You just said everything I wanted to.
Sorry.
Also a Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army Reserve, and a Democrat from Indiana, where we have Governor Holcomb, who sent a contingent of soldiers down to the border for Operation Lone Star, only to see poorly trained soldier then fire his weapon at somebody, and then to only see that same month in March, his commander, who had been in charge, the Texas Army National Guard, the TAG, two-star general standing behind former President Trump during a political campaign stump. And it's Governor Holcomb, and so you're seeing more moderate governors falling into this trap and abusing National Guardsmen, like was highlighted.
So my challenge, I guess, with giving either of you an answer that you would appreciate is, I think of the first days of COVID. I could not have, and if you're in Montana, usually when I say COVID, I'd say, sorry, it's my fault because I must have created it. I was the governor. I could not have kept our state together were it not for our National Guard. The first folks that we got off cruise ships, no one wanted to pick these people up. And it was National Guard that did so. Setting up testing sites in our Indian nations. The only way that I could do that was through our National Guard. So I would have some concerns of saying that, and it was all volunteers, like you didn't have to necessarily as a soldier or airman go on active on Title X to do this work. I know so many more Montanans would have died were it not for our National Guard. So my reluctance in turning around, and like this in some ways goes back to my earlier statement about norms. There ought to be some norms, right? If Governor Ducey had asked me, I would have definitely weighed that and tried to say, is this within the norms, and is this what he really needs for his state? There are some in Montana that me using the National Guard for COVID thought that that was very, very political because they didn't believe like COVID existed. So as a former governor, I guess I'd have some concerns on saying, here's how we're going to limit that. But it ought to be, I also truly believe that the veteran brand, back to your point, it is so strong in communities. And I hope at some point then There's also a whole lot more veterans that are standing up and saying, let's look at the norms, what a governor should be using his National Guard soldiers and airmen for. And maybe that's what prevents it. I just don't know what the legislative fix would be, because unfortunately we're now living in a world where everything seems to someone to be political.
That's right. Where everything is looked at through a political lens, and that's a problem. That's a huge problem that we've got, and so the messages there needs to be from both sides of the political aisles to say, dial it back, and let's look at the common good. Let's have more dialogues instead of monologues when it comes to our politics in our country, and that is, I think you nailed it right there at the end, that this is a problem for us. It's the problem for the citizens as much as it is anybody else, because so much everyday life. You know, I come from Alabama, where for the longest time, you know, the first question that some kid got was, are you for Alabama or Auburn? No longer. It is, are you a Republican or Democrat? And that is true throughout the country, and that is a real danger, because the answer ought to be, I'm an American.
Quite frankly, I thought the NFL was the only thing holding this country together, and then Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce became politicized.
There's so many uninformed.
We lost that too. All right, sir.
Good afternoon. As Chris said, when it comes to domestic terrorism, communities such as the LGBT community, black and brown communities, those from faiths such as Islam or Judaism are well aware of their existence. And as someone who was born and raised in the United States and has studied U.S. history and knows that the rise of domestic terrorism coincides with the abolishment of slavery. For example, the KKK was established the same year the 13th Amendment was ratified. And additionally, a lack of intervention from the federal government during the Reconstruction has only emboldened domestic terrorists and created a space for those individuals to infiltrate governing and legislative bodies. As you mentioned earlier, Senator Jones, the idea of the Birmingham police wearing hoods. And so what would it take to convince more of your peers to believe that this is real?
Okay, I'm done.
A lot of softballs today.
I wish I had the answer to that. You know, as someone in the Senate that tried to play both sides, who came from a Jim Crow era, grew up and saw that. But we need to remember, and I think one of the problems, I have this weird political theory that is based on Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And what I see sometimes from the left is as far to the left as it is of what occurred from the right. And we need to remember, violence is not just confined to the far right. If you remember, for those old enough in here to remember, in the early 1970s, there were thousands of bombings across this country by the radical left. Thousands, okay? So I think the first step is to recognize we got to get everybody's house in order. And everybody needs to recognize. And I'm not blaming the left. I'm just saying that sometimes we have this tendency to only point fingers. You look at what's happening right now. I do some work with the Center for American Progress, and we're trying to work with a bipartisan group about political violence and getting folks to speak out. And one of the things that we have seen in the last year is swatting. And you see that. And it's not just Michael Fanone's mother who was getting swatted this week. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene getting swatted. That is not some far right. So we've got to have I think, some very open and honest dialogues about where the political violence is and the rhetoric. And I do see it. I don't think there's any question that the political dog whistles that you see are much more coming from the far right now. But I think one of the things that we've got to do is acknowledge that we've got to all pull back and try to figure out how to get together. And that's easier said than done. because it's hard to have those conversations around your own Thanksgiving dinner, much less with someone in your community when they are screaming and hollering at you. Trust me, I've been on those before. But I do think we've got to have the ability, both public, and we've got to have some public officials. We need more profiles in courage who are willing to stand up and speak out, but do it in a way that recognizes that there are issues that we have to solve. And when you have those kind of dialogues and when you have those public officials and candidates, right, I think that will go a long way and people will see it. But that may be Pollyannish.
Chris, as someone who's spent a significant amount of time in these spaces, I'm wondering if you have a perspective that you'd like to share.
One thing I would say is that there's a very real danger in creating a false equivalency between things perceived as left-wing violence and right-wing violence. Is there a world in which politically left actors could start using violence as a way to express themselves or accomplish political goals? Yes. That's not part of the landscape right now, and I think it's really important that this is an issue that we don't, especially when talking at the national level, don't try to create convenient binaries and are able to be factual in our understanding of who is doing the violence and who they're doing it to. I think one thing, but the gentleman who came up and spoke, I mean, he articulated essentially the most concise but accurate description of what we're talking about when we describe domestic extremism, right? The big uniting factor is anti-government, and then when you scratch the surface of that, the other organizing principle is essentially white supremacy, at least in the United States. That's not an opinion, right? That's anybody who's ever studied this space and knows what they're talking about is going to tell you. We also can't talk about it like that. So I would say to the people in this room, and especially the two officers who spoke, I was former enlisted. I have no idea. Y'all figure it out. But what I will say is that you guys are in a position to yeah, you might be having to put your neck out on the line, right? You might be potentially sacrificing a career when you go up to that colonel or that full bird and say, sir, the way you're talking about this is actually false. I'm not suggesting that the answer is everybody step up in the uncomfortable conversations and be willing to push back against misunderstandings around this issue, but maybe. I think another thing is that the people in this room, by and large, represent one of the most enfranchised groups of people in America, period. Y'all are not the target of this, right? You're the last people that these groups are going to try and hurt because you are protected. Your ability to move government levers, your ability to be in Washington, D.C., it does make you safer than the people that far-right groups and domestic terror groups and insurgencies around the world, anywhere they are, right? They want to go after the weakest civilians, and they want to drive a wedge between them and the state. And so I think kind of the one catch-all is the more you can make the government present in communities, a thing that helps more than hurts, right? In West Virginia, the only time I interact with my local government is when I need to either get parking tickets paid or they come to turn off my utilities because I missed a utility bill by like 2 days. That shouldn't be the primary way I interact with the state and federal government. Counterinsurgency, right? It's real and perceived grievances. If the government and public sector and civic society is not addressing the real grievances, you're going to be chasing the perceived ones in circles. And going after things like political violence, to me, is putting a lot of emphasis on perceived grievances, and now you're trying to change emotions versus changing people's reality.
Yeah. We are at basically a time, so we're going to have to wrap this up, but we're all going to be here. I do want to shout out a couple of folks who are in the room who are also major players. Doug was our our White House press secretary. White House press secretary has some of the funniest lines in the film, so I hope you'll get a chance to watch it. How you can do that? So we will be in limited theatrical release later this year in a select few markets, and then we'll be on streaming, Amazon, iTunes, and hopefully a major streamer. Although I'll tell you that most of the major streamers, their buyers have said we love it, and their corporate overlords have said, ooh, this is a little dicey for our shareholders. So that's the world we live in. We'll also be doing a tour to about 50 college campuses in the fall. If you represent or work with an organization or institution that is interested in hosting a screening, we'd love to bring the film to you at no cost. And then right here in DC on June 14th, so just a few weeks from now, we'll be doing a screening at the DC DocX Festival with a panel afterwards moderated by Kara Swisher. So if you're in the DC area, we'd love to have you. Our website is wargamefilm.com. You can see all the screening opportunities, request a screener, et cetera there. Thank you to all the Truman members who participated and helped us recruit folks to participate. There were so many folks, including Benjamin Rad, who designed the scenario, and many, many others. So just want to thank Truman for giving us the network to be able to put this all together and to have this conversation. And we look forward to continue to talk to you, hopefully, as the day goes on. So thank you again.